I wanted to add a few reinforcements to what Peter said, because he does such good work, and I think he asks the right questions and gets to the ways that we need to look at things. But I did a good deal of work at 9/11 Research Project on the Mineta matter, and I think it has to be a stand-down order that's being discussed, because the only plane that gets within the 50-mile zone, which is an air defense identification zone around D.C. for the P-56, is 77. No other plane gets that close in this scenario. And the other reason I think it's not a shoot-down order, which Mineta was speculating about, is that there's nothing up in the air to shoot it down with. They may have scrambled the planes in Langley 130 miles away. In order to, were you waiting to come up, or?
No.
Oh, okay. I just thought maybe if it sit. Can't see.
We have your address.
The planes from Langley, the pilots said that they were being sent to New York. And then the 9/11 Commission says they were being sent to intercept a Phantom jet. Well, you can't intercept a Phantom jet. The only way you send a scrambler is with coordinates that relate to an actual blip on a screen that's traveling in a certain direction at a certain speed, and you go to intercept it. So you don't put a scramble plane up to fly around and see if it can find a Phantom jet. It makes no sense. All right. So, but they're told that they're on the way to New York, and when they get to D.C. finally, they're asked to verify the plume of smoke on the Pentagon. They're asked to verify that the Pentagon's been hit, because by the time they get up there, it's already hit. And so there's nothing in the air to shoot it down with. And had there been something in the air to shoot it down with, the discussion would not have been, sir, it's 50 miles out, it's 30 miles out, it's 10 miles out from the city that it's coming to. It would have been, sir, the bogey is 10 miles away, the bogey is 5 miles away, the bogey is 2 miles away, do we still shoot it down? So for just those three logical reasons, the only thing that's left is that they're talking about 77, which is the only plane they can be talking about. They did know it was coming. They announced it on Channel 8 local news in D.C. that one of the hijacked planes was coming to D.C. about 20 minutes before I felt the impact of the plane hitting Pentagon on my windows. And that isn't the Channel News investigative team who suddenly discovered this. It was announced.
What is Cheney saying? Don't shoot it down?
Yes. Yes. And that's why the guy finally says, what, does the order still stand? It's 10 miles away, sir.
Isn't it possible that what Cheney said, or the Air Force officer said, was not quite what Mineta? Maybe he compromised.
Well, I don't even remember the guy being. I heard a lot of people say Air Force officer. He just says young man in the testimony.
I forget now if it's before.
And then I saw a recent thing saying they thought it might have been Josh Bolton. It was the person that brought it up, but I don't know either.
What I'm guessing is possibly he did say no. The shoot down, the stand down order still stands. And they got Mineta to maybe compromise his testimony somewhat.
Well, I don't know why Mineta thought there was a shoot-down order, or that was a shoot-down order, but that's what he told the commission. I don't know whether he's prevaricating, but he said, I thought it was a shoot-down order.
Does he say that?
Yeah, right after. There's in the interchange. He says he thought it was a shoot-down order, but it can't be. And then there was also, I think it's after 93 hits, because it's not too much longer till 93 hits. And then there's this speculation, did we shoot down 93? Was there a shoot-down order? But also, Bush complained himself that there was no possible communication because his secure line went dead for 2 hours on Air Force One, which is indicative. It's like the Federal Exchange phones going dead at the 12:30, at 1:30 Eastern Time on November 22nd. It's indicative of a coup. And he's being kept out of the loop and away from the power. But in terms of the continuity of government, they also announced that publicly in D.C. that day, that they had gone to continuity of government, which I knew what that meant. And it means that normal Congress is suspended. Key people, the President, the Vice President, certain select members of the Cabinet, and a small contingent of leadership in the Congress that's handpicked, become the government. And the Washington Post, a month later, had a headline this big, shadow government operating in secret. And that's where it said that Cheney and these other people in the cabinet were meeting 24/7 in shifts in an undisclosed location in a bunker, which I believe is probably Blue Mountain, Virginia, where they had the one set up down there. And they had to refurbish it because they had closed it and put computers back into it. But, you know, and if we ever do go to Code Red, if you ever hear Code Red announced, you're going into martial law. Because there are 150 federal laws that are going to change. And especially now that it's a designated military district, but even before that, the plans from the 50s on were that once they declared that kind of a national emergency, the military controls communications, it controls the roads, the federal highway system was designed to be able to be shut off and used solely for military purpose. You know, it controls plans that they have for roundup of people in certain areas or detention facilities that date back to the 50s and the McCarran period. They were using the old Japanese concentration camps as well as military bases that they had secured. Right before they had the invasion of Cambodia, when they had the student strike going on, they called the Guard out and they activated. In 13 states, they activated the camps. They sent the National Guard in, they turned the gas and the water on, and they had the camps ready to go right before the Kent State shootings. Because they didn't know which way the country would go when they shot the students. Okay, and then they shot the students at Jackson State, the black students, and the students at Kent State. But we were working with the Guard, doing GI organizing. And those Guard units that were sent into Kent State had been on a trucker strike for 3 days and were dead tired, and they were sent in illegally with loaded guns and ordered to shoot on the students. And the whole thing was, you know, set up to scare the anti-war movement and the country back into line, but they didn't know if we'd go the other way, so they actually opened the camps and had them ready in Rex 84. And if you go back and read the Tom Charles Houston plan that Peter mentioned, go and read it. Not all of it was released, but 7 points were released. You are reading the Bush agenda post 9/11, the surveillance, everything that they're doing. And the erosion of posse comitatus begins with the drug war and with the war of COINTELPRO, which escalated into military training of the police, MOVE in Philadelphia, AIM, and the creation of the joint task forces, which combined military and civilian police together in their response, but also a military response to the drug war. And then now erosion of civilian courts into military commissions, and the ability of people to be defined as enemy combatants, including American citizens, if they want to define you that way, and you have no way to challenge it, you know, and you don't have right of habeas corpus, and you won't. And one of the bills that Cynthia introduced was to restore posse comitatus, and it was part of the Patriot Act restoration in the previous Congress, and they had said we're keeping it in place. But when I wrote to all 118 people who voted for that bill and said, "Will you reaffirm now posse comitatus?" Nary one. I think I had one representative wrote back and said, "I'll co-sponsor a bill to support posse comitatus."
What is
Posse comitatus was an act that was passed in the period after the Civil War, when during the Reconstruction period, the Northern troops went down and took over civilian functioning and started hanging people and holding military commission courts, and they were out of control, and they said, no, you can't do that. It also broke down after Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and there was eventually a Supreme Court, but the entire period of World War II, from the day of Pearl Harbor on, the District of Hawaii was a military district, and they made people use military courts. And the Supreme Court said, no, if there's a civilian infrastructure that exists and is working, you use that, you don't replace it until it isn't working with anything that looks like a military court. So, I mean, there's a long history to how this is eroded, but now they've set up these conditions and studies how they'd go, you know, from conventional to chemical, biological to nuclear attack. From the 80s on, they studied terrorism, counterterrorism, and the response is to ratchet up toward martial law. But if they ever declare the full emergency and the continuity of government, then they do suspend the Constitution and they put you under essentially military rule. And like there was a 16-man committee in Nixon's White House, Office of Emergency Preparedness, that included James McCord, and his responsibility would have been control of all mail and media in the United States in an emergency. And there was an Office of Emergency Preparedness that Bush headed up and was appointed to 6 days before Reagan was shot, and they asked him what constitutes an emergency, and he said the president will know it when he sees it. Okay, this is 6 days before the shooting of Reagan and the takeover by Bush for the first term. So there's foundation here, but I think, you know, he's onto some very critical stuff. So I'll shut up and we should go to the next speaker, but I just wanted to reinforce some of the stuff that he said. John Hankey, independent researcher and investigator out of Los Angeles. He'll give you some more on his background, and he's doing a little slideshow. He's done work on other political assassinations. He did groundbreaking work on the murder of Gary Webb, and on John F. Kennedy Jr.'s death, and on Paul Wellstone and other scenarios. So, and he's probably going to talk about George Bush, or the Bush family. He likes them.
That'll probably happen. John told me I should count on 20 minutes, so that what I have on slides I can get through in 20 minutes. I don't have anything in here on Gary Webb, but I'd be happy to touch on that, and we can go into it as deep as anybody wants to. And Paul Wellstone ties in, but it's fairly brief. I wanted to quickly say that I teach history. I've taught history for 20 years in LA Unified and in the inner city, and my students don't know anything, but they're brilliant, and so they're just wonderful to have in discussions. And I think that this stuff goes back a long ways, and if anybody's inclined, we can talk for a while about the Pope and the incredible hoaxes that the Pope has perpetrated on the people of Christendom, if you can use that term. Abraham Lincoln ran for Congress and got elected, and when the slave owners started the Mexican-American War on the pretext, said Lincoln, that the Mexican army had attacked the U.S. Army on American soil, Lincoln stood up and challenged the basis of that war, and he said, I think you're lying, and I want to see the spot. He introduced something called the Spot Resolution, and like Cynthia McKinney, and like Wayne Morse, and like Senator Groening, and like Senator Church, the opposition, who were the moneyed people, right, the slave owners were the moneyed people in the country, just poured money into the coffers of the opposition, and he didn't get re-elected to the House. He ran for Senate. Slave owners poured money in, and he lost to the run for the Senate. He lost the run for the Senate twice, I think, and then ran for president on the Republican ticket. So Cynthia McKinney and nobody else should feel bad about losing for the right reason. They stand in a long line of really important people. I wanted to throw out really quickly, I said this is not new stuff. Lincoln's main enemy, and he said that he feared the bankers more than he feared the slave owners. During the Civil War, he said that he feared the bankers. He said that I got the slave owners fighting me in the front and the bankers in my rear, and I'm more afraid of the bankers. The most famous banker that he had in his rear was Samuel Chase, that Chase Manhattan Bank is named for. We're not fighting different guys. This is very much the same stuff. I got a couple of videos, JFK to the Bush connection and the assassination of JFK Jr., and I have taken a leave from teaching, so I don't have an income. Please feel free to buy one of these. You can also see them for free on Google if you're so inclined, and I'd encourage you to do that. You can get them at Amazon, and I'd encourage you to do that. You can also get them from my website, which is bushkilljfk.com.
Can you lower the projector?
I can probably lower the projector a little bit.
If you move your stuff off of there,
Oh, okay.
then you
That's
can
how
put
it
your-
works.
your,
I see. Sure.
you need these papers. probably.
No, I don't. Just
You don't?
move now.
Okay. And then we can put this back down on here.
Okay, well, we may now have to raise it. No, that'll work. That'll work. Okay, well, let's move on. I got a bar here for some reason. The way that I started on this, the morning that John Kennedy Jr., the morning after his plane crashed at 9:39 at night, 9:40, I suppose. And the next morning at 7 o'clock in the morning, I was on my way to a conference of teachers, and I heard on the radio that John Kennedy Jr.'s plane was missing. And I'm not a religious guy, but I said a prayer for him. And I mean, I'm an atheist, but I said a prayer for him. And went on my way to the conference and was involved with all these, really fired up people on all these important issues. And I forgot about it. And I came home and my wife said, let's go out to eat. We went to our favorite Thai restaurant in LA, and we sat down and ordered the food. And I looked up, and there's Dan Rather on the television supervising the news reporting, and some of you are, I'm sure, familiar with Rather. He was the only newsman for 25 years who was allowed to see the Zapruder film. And there's 2,000 reporters in Dallas the day of the assassination, and they hear that there's a video, and an 8mm film of the assassination, and they hear that they don't get to hear it, and they just go nuts. Well, you killed him, right? If you're not going to let us see it, you must have killed him. And so the FBI made a deal. We will let one of you see it, and then he will come out and tell everybody that it says what we say it says. And Rather went in and came out and reported. And you can actually, it's on the internet if you look. You can hear his voice giving the report that the president's head clearly jerked forward. And of course, all of you who have seen the Zapruder film know that that's not the truth. So when I saw Rather on the screen with pretty much that picture, I became physically ill. They brought this wonderful food, and I couldn't eat. I was just overwhelmed with my gut telling me they killed him. And I sat there thinking about, well, why do I feel so terribly horrible about it? And I sat there thinking about it, and about how Rather had supervised to a very large extent in the information that came out about the Kennedy assassination Sr. And when the reason that I felt so sick was that when they killed John Kennedy Sr., they in very rapid succession killed Malcolm X, and then Martin Luther, and then Bobby, and then dozens of Panthers. I mean, people are talking about martial law. Well, the Black Panthers lived under, the worst thing that you can possibly imagine, I think. They didn't even get a chance to go to concentration camps, They got wiped out in their beds in the street. And then 50,000 U.S. troops, and then 2 million, by many estimates, Vietnamese and Cambodians and Southeast Asians, and my gut was telling me this is coming. And Gary Webb was murdered, and Paul Wellstone was murdered, and nearly 3,000 U.S. troops have been, let's say, murdered. I mean, come on, how is that not murder? The latest estimate of the Lancet, the British medical magazine, is 600,000 Iraqis. So that was my beginning with this, and I really have been possessed by this topic for 6 years, and although I'm feeling much relieved at the moment, but until I got this video done, I couldn't let it go. One of the main topics that, if people were paying attention to it, I mean, a lot of people were disturbed by the news that John Kennedy Jr. was dead, and one of the main topics that immediately came to people's attention, and there was considerable discussion about it on the internet, was that there was no search and there was no rescue. There was this incredible delay, and I'm going to deal with those topics not necessarily in chronological order, but hopefully in a somewhat logical order. The first easiest thing to talk about is that every private and military plane, for that matter, is required to carry what's called an ELT, an emergency locator transmitter. The military and the civilians have a very complex and sophisticated system. If you crash your plane they have to triangulate it, and they may have to wait for the satellites to move before they can triangulate, although his plane went down in one of the busiest corridors on the face of the earth, so it's not likely that they had to wait. They should have known instantly exactly the location that his plane went down. There's nothing in the NTSB report, there's no mention of the ELT virtually. There's certainly no mention of why there was no ELT report. I talked to the manufacturer of the ELT. He said if the ELT malfunctioned, we were supposed to be notified. There's supposed to be a hearing to determine why it malfunctioned, and we're supposed to make an accounting and either explain ourselves and be excused, or we're going to have to revise our manufacturer. We didn't get notified. I told him what the report said. He said, to me, it said that the battery had been worn down, It was 1.4 volts or whatever. And he said, well, that would seem to indicate that it was working, because the battery wouldn't be worn down unless it was working. So apparently the ELT went off, and ABC News showed that the ELT went off, throughout this case, you find that the news people had the information. I mean, people in this community and in general, I think, tend to kick reporters in the ass and complain about the media. You would have been proud of the reporters at the press conference at the Pentagon. They went after these guys, and I mean, it changed my attitude towards reporters, that there's a lot of really, really good reporters who get a lot of really, really good information. Tom Weicker on the front page of the New York Times, the afternoon of the assassination, got published saying throat wounds, wound on the left temple, huge hole in the back of the head. All of this stuff was in the front page of the New York Times because Weicker got it in there, and it was subsequently buried. Anyhow, the reporters did a good job, and that is one of the things that appeared on the press. So the question is, what happened to the ELT report. That's one aspect of it. All the reports that the plane was missing were ignored by the FAA. The FAA and the Air Force in a conspiracy to commit crimes? Well, for example, just quickly, there's a guy, Adam Budd, and he's a good scout. There were people waiting for the plane to land. They said, the plane hasn't landed, what's up? At 10 o'clock, they went to Budd and asked about the plane. And Budd said, well, if it's late, let's call the FAA. And he called the FAA and he told the Boston Globe that the FAA was really rude to him and they did not want to hear about it. That's at 10 o'clock. At 12 o'clock, Carol Radziwill, I need to talk about her a little bit. Okay, John Kennedy Jr. is on the plane. His wife, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, is on the plane. Carolyn's sister is on the plane. Carolyn's Bessette Kennedy's best friend is Carol Radziwill. Carol Radziwill is married to John's cousin, who was John's closest friend. I may not have believed that the first time that I heard it, but I read the book and did some more background checking. I'm very much persuaded. In any case, she talked to Carolyn Kennedy just before the plane took off. They were supposed to have dinner the following night. She's an Emmy Award-winning TV news producer. She's not a babe in the woods, right? It's a person who can produce news for television and who can win an Emmy for doing it, knows how to make a phone call, knows how to call up an agency, knows how to deal with bureaucracies. And she got a phone call at midnight that the plane was missing. And from midnight until 2 a.m., she called every FAA facility on the East Coast, pretty much. I mean, that's a little bit of an exaggeration. She wouldn't have called facilities that couldn't possibly have helped, but I think it is safe to say, and not an exaggeration in the least, that she called every FAA facility that could possibly have had anything to do with this, and none of them would help her. You're not supposed to have to try to get the FAA to help you. If you call up the FAA and say a plane's overdue, they're not supposed to ask you to justify them conducting a search. They're supposed to conduct a search right now. Because you said the plane was missing, they're supposed to immediately begin a search. They completely ignored her. And at 2:15 a.m. she gave up trying to get the FAA to do anything, and she called the Coast Guard. And the Coast Guard said, Kennedy? She called the Boston Coast Guard. And they said, Kennedy, we're on it. And they notified the media that Kennedy's plane was missing, and they immediately jumped into action. Unfortunately, they immediately called the FAA. And the FAA said, hang on a second, and they called the Air Force. And the Air Force called the Coast Guard and said, go search Long Island. This is an order. We are now in charge. Go search Long Island. And they sent them 150 miles away from where the plane could possibly have gone down, where they wasted their time for the next 15 and a half hours. At 11 p.m., this is according to the book The Day John Died. I don't have any other source for this, although I did find one article, I don't remember if it was in the Boston Globe, that Kennedy was furious at the FAA, didn't say why, said that there were very bitter feelings between Edward Kennedy and the FAA because of the events of John's death. At 11 p.m., the story goes from the Boston Globe, I believe, this was The Day John Died, that he started calling the FAA and could get absolutely no action out of them. At 6 o'clock in the morning, he woke up Podesta. He called the White House and woke up Podesta. At 7, Podesta woke up Clinton, and Clinton woke up the Air Force and told them get some planes in the air, which they did, scattering them all over the Atlantic and directing them away from the crash site. According to the New York Times, at 5 a.m., a detailed study of the radar had been completed. This is 5 a.m., and when do you suppose they sent search vessels to the crash area? At 1:30. This is 15 and a half hours after the plane crashed. And somebody do the math. 8.5 hours after the New York Times said they had the most detailed radar report imaginable in their hands. 8.5 hours later, the Coast Guard said, and I have the video of it, we don't have the radar information, but the luggage is washing up. We're on the shores of Martha's Vineyard. We're going to go search the waters off of Martha's Vineyard. And if you don't count that, I have no idea when if ever, the researchers were given the radar information about the location of the plane crash. But at 1:30, the Coast Guard said, we're going to defy the Pentagon, and we're going to go in based on the debris. A 15 and a half hour delay. Now, I want you to pause for at least a second and think about that for a minute. This is the Kennedy family, right? There's a senator involved in this. They're used to their family members being assassinated, and you're going to thumb your nose at them in this sort of a way. I mean, this is an incredible provocation, don't you think? I think that, right, this sort of a delay is just an incredible provocation. The file you're attempting to play has an extension that does not match the file format. I don't know what you're talking about. We're not going to worry about it. No. Do you want the player to play the file? I'm going to say no. I don't know what's going on. Oh, that's why. Yes, I do want it to play the file. Can I go back and try it again? Okay, let's try. I don't know. Well, it's just, no, it's not a file. It's part of the, on my computer, it plays without asking the question. It's part of the...
Well, but it was like an MP3 file originally.
It's embedded, originally, I don't even remember. It was embedded into the PowerPoint, embedded into the PowerPoint. An AIF, it was originally, it might have been a .mov. Let's see what happens. We'll tell it yes. And we're going to tell it yes and see what happens. Nothing's happening. I'm sorry. And if we have time and if people are really dying, I can walk across the hall and get one of the videos, right, the video that I made. It has the Coast Guard spokesman talking to WCVB TV in Boston. This story was all over the internet. Well, it was, if you were looking for it, it was widely displayed on the internet that Todd Burgun, who was the chief petty officer and he is the Coast Guard spokesman, comes on the television and he says that John Kennedy contacted the tower, that the contact was at 9:39, that he was on final approach, and that, I guess that's the end of the story. That 9:39, John Kennedy was on final approach and approximately 14 miles off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. That was at about 10 o'clock in the morning. At around noon, the Pentagon took over the reporting of the news and they killed that story. They didn't make any reference to Burgun. They just said that Kennedy did not contact any of the air traffic control facilities. His flight instructors say that's outrageous. Kennedy was the most careful, cautious, rule-following pilot, and one of the most basic rules there is, if not the rule number one, is that you contact the air traffic control facilities. The Pentagon says he didn't. This guy, so let's look at that, right? The Pentagon says no, Todd Burgun says yes, and quickly to compare them. Burgun is a professional. He does this sort of stuff every day. He knows the people at the FAA because he talks to them when he has to make a report to the news people. He knows the people in the news, right? And he knows that corridor between the guys who collect the information and the media who are anxious to get it. He walks that corridor. He's professional at doing it. In any case, set that aside, the fact that he's a skilled professional. The NTSB, a year later, a year after the plane crash, issued their report, 350 pages. In it, they have a very detailed, second-by-second radar analysis of the final moments of the plane. And I got a hold of one of John Kennedy's flight instructors stationed at Martha's Vineyard, his oldest flight instructor, a guy named Arthur Marks, and we went over it in detail, and he said John was on final approach. What it describes is exactly what would have been typical for John's flight into Martha's Vineyard. I think he flew 8 times in the previous 2 months. So I mean, this was saying typical, you're saying a lot. This was a flight that he made a lot, and according to Arthur Marks, what is described in the NTSB report is John's plane on final approach, holding at 2,500 feet, which is what you have to do before you contact the tower. So John's plane was holding it, right, this story by the NTSB, the radar report, completely, in every way imaginable, corroborates Burgun's report, that the plane was on final approach, 14 miles off, at 9:39 exactly. Well, how could Burgun have come up with a false report that was false about the tower contact, but accurate in every other way? Where could he possibly have gotten that information? Well, obviously, I think it's very, very obvious that Burgun was telling the truth. Now, the fact that Kennedy contacted the tower, and I'll say that, the fact, as I hope we just established, that Kennedy contacted the tower is very important for a couple of reasons. One is if you contact the tower and say you're on final approach and you don't land, FAA regulations, within 5 minutes, if you don't land, they're supposed to begin a search. if you contact any of the air traffic control facilities, and this was explained to me by the head of the NTSB, the guy who signed as the chairman of the NTSB report, explained to me, I don't remember in what context, certainly not in this context, he explained to me that if you contact any of the air traffic control facilities, that your plane is required to have a transponder, and they give you a code and you type it in, and your transponder emits a signal that is picked up by the radar that tells the FAA where you are and who you are and what your altitude is, and most importantly, if your plane descends lower than 100 feet any place but on the runway of the airport that they said that you told them that you were going to, it sets off an alarm at the FAA headquarters. The point is, they knew that Kennedy's plane was in trouble before it hit the water. It set off an alarm. If he contacted the tower, which I think we have demonstrated that he did, his plane set off an alarm before it hit the water, and it took them 15.5 hours. An alarm that told them what the crash location was. And it took them 15.5 hours to send somebody, which is just an enormous provocation to the Kennedy family. Well, what the hell is going on? I'm going to quickly throw in Sherman Skolnick. I don't know if any of you guys have heard of him, and I don't want to say anything bad about him. I think he died recently. There's a number of reports you can find on the internet that there was a bomb on the plane. Well, so let's ask the question, what happened? And there are people who answered that question saying there was a bomb on the plane. The NTSB report shows that all of the electronics were functioning on impact. If you have a light bulb and it's turned off and you break it, it looks differently than if it's turned on and you break it. And so they can tell where the little lights were on because the bulbs, the word they use is stressed. Everybody following that? So they could tell that all the electronics were on. I've seen stuff on the internet that said, oh, they sent some kind of a special particle beam, whatnot, and killed the electronics. The NTSB report says no. The NTSB report says there was no evidence of a fire or any sort of physical damage. There's absolutely nothing in the NTSB report to indicate what put that plane into the water. The debris was recovered in a relatively tight pattern. It would have been spread across miles if the plane had been blown up in the air. In addition to which, there's reports from citizens on the beach who recovered the luggage saying that the luggage was intact, and given the way that the plane went straight down, that would suggest that the bomb, if there was one, would have been in the tail of the plane. But when I encounter this argument, what I say to people is that the Warren Commission report and documents are just, it's a gold mine of evidence that Kennedy was killed by a conspiracy. The 9/11 report has the Mineta testimony right in it, right? It's a gold mine of killer stuff. And the NTSB report has nothing, right? I spent a couple of years studying it. It has nothing in it to suggest that there was a bomb. So what the hell's going on? This is the radar report of the final seconds of the plane, the final minute, I guess, minute and a half, descending, and then he contacts the tower, and about a minute after he contacts the tower, the plane went straight down into the water. Well, if the moon was out, the manager at the Martha's Vineyard Airport said the moon was out. It was not hazy. Kennedy didn't get lost. He had a very sophisticated autopilot. The previous owner of the plane says that the autopilot on that plane, at the push of a button, the plane would take you to your location, to the runway of the airport, if you put in the coordinates, which you would do at the start of the flight. How do you explain this? And I don't think it's too much to suggest that if you're in a plane that's doing fine in clear weather with good sound avionics and it does this, you committed suicide. And please feel free to argue and point something out that I've missed, but that looks like a suicide to me. And this is the thing that gave me fits for a long time. I'm page 350, right? I'm going through this thing with a fine-tooth comb, and I've gotten to page 350 without finding anything to answer the question of what put that plane into the water, and I find that the fuel valve was in the off position. And I'm just ripping my hair out. What the hell does that mean? And I'm calling up everybody I know, and I got out the Yellow Pages, and I called up every flight instructor in the Los Angeles Yellow Pages, and that's quite a number, and any of them that would talk, who are talking about this, and what do you think? What do you think? And I'm not sure so let's talk about the fuel valve for a second. That is the fuel valve. Well, I'm sorry, it is the fuel valve from a Piper Saratoga. Right tank, left tank. In order to keep the plane balanced, you move this back and forth. This is a keeper. This is, that's an idiot button that that will prevent you from accidentally moving the switch all the way over to off. You need two hands. You need to push that button with one hand while you move the lever with the other in order for the lever to get into the off position. How the hell did the lever get into the off position? It's crazy. It could not possibly have happened by accident. John turned the fuel valve off before he committed suicide. It doesn't make any sense. So I'm talking to one of these flight instructors, and he tells me, well, you know, it is very strange, but strange things will happen. You know, the pilot on Egypt Air 990 turned the fuel valve off. This guy tells me. And I said, what? And he said, yeah. You know, you guys familiar with Egypt Air 990? This guy walks into the cockpit and he says something about Allah help me, or, you know, he invokes the standard, not suicidal and not maniacal, just a standard thing that you might say when you're encountering a difficult task, invoking the name of Allah and asking for His help. The guy's name is Gamil Batuti, and he grabs the steering yoke and pushes it forward, and I've heard different reports, but what I thought I read from the NTSB was that the cockpit voice recorders recorded a struggle in the cockpit, and in any case, what the flight instructor, who I was speaking with, who told me the whole story, tells me is there's 5 pilots grab him and rip him away from the controls, and then they're struggling to recover the plane, and while they're struggling to recover the plane, this sneaky devil reaches over and turns off the fuel control valve, and the engines die, and the plane goes straight into the water.
Was he part of the flight crew?
I'm sorry?
Was he not part of the flight?
Oh, he was part of the flight crew. But he wasn't the part of the flight crew assigned to plunge the plane into the water. 50 miles from where John Kennedy Jr.'s plane went down, 100 days after John Kennedy Jr.'s plane went down. Now, I don't want to make too much out of that, but I want you to make sure you hear it, that very much and in a similar time and place. But the point is that if closing the fuel valve means suicide, we now have 2 really major pieces of evidence that indicate that somebody on that plane committed suicide. In the interest of time, I'm going to just... But what do you make of that? John Kennedy Jr. committed suicide. John Kennedy Jr. had a staff meeting that day, and there were small financial difficulties with the newspaper. The guy's a millionaire. Not serious financial problems. And he told his staff, don't worry, he said, as long as I'm alive, you will have a job this magazine will publish. And then he went out and committed suicide. Any number of witnesses to say that John was extremely upbeat and enthusiastic and that he was planning to have kids. A Canadian businessman whose name escapes me at the moment says that John was talking as though his wife were pregnant.
John, to clarify, I think you said two famous people on that plane committed suicide. Did you mean to say that?
Did I say that?
I think you said somebody on that plane.
Somebody on that plane committed suicide.
Okay. Thank you.
The question is who? And how the hell can we answer that question? Well, keep pushing. I mean, that's all I ever did was say, now what? Well, keep pushing. Carol Radziwill, the Coast Guard called her Radawell, and for 5.5 years that's what I thought her name was, and then she was on Oprah and she published the book, and I found out the actual name of the person who called the Coast Guard. She was the best friend. She spoke with Carolyn minutes before the plane took off. They were supposed to have dinner. At 2:15 she called the Coast Guard, and she said that there was a flight instructor on the plane. Now, if anybody were going to be in a position to know the truth of that, I think she's it. However, she's not all of it. Richard Blow was John's editor at George Magazine, his closest business associate. He published a book called America's Son about his relationship with John Kennedy, and in that book he discussed the fact that the day of the plane crash, John had had the cast taken off his foot. He was flying this little lighter-than-air, you know, like an airborne go-kart, 3 months before, and he hit a tree and it broke his foot, and so he had the cast on. It had just been taken off that day, but he's still on crutches, and he says he went to lunch with John and that he noticed on the way back, John talked about the fact that let's read it. I'm flying to Hyannisport for my cousin Rory's wedding, he said. I glanced at John's foot. Even the short walk from the restaurant back to the office had tired him, then gave him a skeptical look. Don't worry, he said, I'm flying with a flight instructor, with an instructor. Just don't crash, okay. So we have the 2 closest people to John and his wife have both said that there was a flight instructor on the plane. At 7 o'clock in the morning, when I heard that John Kennedy's plane was missing, I heard that there was a flight instructor on the plane. But when I got home from the restaurant and went to bed and opened the paper the next day to read all about it, there was no mention of a flight instructor. And I'm thinking, am I out of my mind? What happened? I mean, there's no mention that originally it was reported that there was a flight instructor, but we found out later, based on something, that there was none. There was nothing. There was no mention of it. It was ignored. Where is the flight instructor? Okay, this is a good question, I think. John told Richard Blow that he was flying with a flight instructor. Well, you know, now one of three things is true. John was lying, Richard Blow was lying, or John had an appointment to fly with a flight instructor, right? I mean, the plane was supposed to take off in like 2 hours. You don't make that statement unless you have an appointment with a flight instructor. John had an appointment. Yeah, come on, he's a professional person. He had an appointment with a flight instructor. Where is the flight instructor with whom John had an appointment that he did not keep? That person is missing. Other reasons to think that there was a flight instructor on that plane. One, John never flew the plane without a flight instructor. That's a pretty good reason, right? That's some pretty solid evidence to think that there was a flight instructor on the plane. If you didn't have anything else, that would be very solid evidence to think that there was a flight instructor on the plane. Two, this was a new plane. It had all this fancy aeronautics on it. I mean, my favorite example is that you have a computer. It's got Windows on it. Yeah, what do you know about operating Windows? Enough to make the programs that you want to work, but you know that there's a world of stuff that you don't know about. Well, John's plane was that way, except that he wanted to know how to use all of the bells and whistles, and because they're all safety features, right? And if you're a good, cautious pilot, which every single one of John's flight instructors emphatically said that he was a very cautious pilot, you want to know. So you have a flight instructor, and while you're flying, he shows you the next thing that you don't know about. Jay Biederman, the main instructor at that time, John went through a series over the course of, I think, 20 years of flying. He had enough hours, over 300 hours, enough to be a flight instructor. Biederman says that he was very good at the autopilot, very competent at the autopilot. Now, the reason we're discussing these is I want you to keep the issue of suicide in the back of your mind. Somebody on that plane committed suicide, and of course, you may have figured out I'm going to suggest it was a flight instructor who committed suicide. Another reason to think John had a broken foot. He was limping around. You don't need your feet to fly a plane. Plane flies with hand controls, but if you're on the ground, you have to use pedals, and the pedals are very painful to operate if you have a bad foot, says one of the news people that I have recorded. The guy hurt his own foot and knew that it was painful to operate with but it's not a hazard, it's an inconvenience. But if you're a millionaire, what do you buy with your money besides convenience? Well, geez, if you don't buy convenience, what are you using your millions of dollars for? Other reasons to think there was a flight instructor on the plane. There was a thick haze in New York. There was not a thick haze at Martha's Vineyard, but there was a thick haze in New York. There had been such a thick haze on the previous 5 of 8 flights that it would have been illegal for John to fly without somebody on that plane who had a instrument license. Now, John had passed the written for getting an instrument license. He had passed the performance for getting an instrument license, but he didn't have an instrument license. And John, all of his flight instructors say, you know, that he would calculate the weight on his flights before flying. That is an example that one of them used. Nobody does that. John did it because you're supposed to do it. Well, nobody ever does, but he did because you're supposed to, and he always did what you were supposed to. It would have been, I want to say unconscionable, it would have been careless and disregarding the rules for him to take off in that haze, knowing that he was more than likely going to encounter conditions that would require a flight instructor. And 5, John had passed the written, he had passed the performance, and he needed to log hours flying next to a flight instructor in order to get his instrument license. There's 5 reasons, and here's my favorite, Lee Harvey Oswald. Other reasons to think that there was a flight instructor on the plane, that is to say, and John, I think, no, it was Peter talked about it, this issue I'm going to raise. Oswald was arrested based upon a description that went out over the police radio, but nobody knows where that, and 20 police descend on the theater and arrest him. But where did the description come from? And the fabrication, the obvious fabrication, the obvious, I mean absolutely necessary, logically necessary fabrication of Oswald's description, and then it's putting out of this description on the police radio, I think, is clear, solid, and important evidence of a conspiracy, right? It's evidence. The fact that this description went out when nobody could possibly have been supplying, nobody could possibly have described the height of the shooter from a 6th floor window, is clear and important evidence.
I have a question about that. wasn't he,
If you like.
sorry. Wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald the only employee at the depository who hadn't been accounted for? So that's why they used his description.
Say it again?
No roll call
That's
taken.
false.
No.
It's my
So there's the
understanding
answer to your
that
question.
He was the only one that was not, they
Well,
didn't come back after lunch.
it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The point is, if the police had said, who's missing? Oswald. What does he look like? Well, he's 5'10" and 165 pounds. Okay, here, take that and put it out over the police radio. If that had happened, you could document that that happened. You can't document that that happened. Nobody knows where the hell this description came from. And, you know, just moving along. I mean, we can come back to it if you like, but there's somebody waiting to use his computer, and I want to move. Other reasons to think that there was a flight instructor. At 12:30 in the p.m., the Pentagon took over the news reporting. We're still working on that question. This is still Oswald in the background. At 12:30, the Pentagon took over. They killed Todd Bergen's report of tower contact, and they killed Carol Radswell's report of a flight instructor on the plane. And they killed it against all of the evidence. There is not a shred of evidence to support the statement that there was no flight instructor on the plane. In fact, the percentage of bodies recovered from ocean crashes is about 20%. So that today there's no evidence, there's no credible evidence that there was not a flight instructor on the plane. The fact that they didn't recover the body of a flight instructor is in no way, shape, or form evidence that there was, well, it's the most weak evidence that there was a flight instructor on the plane. The eradication of the best eyewitness story that there was indeed a flight instructor on the plane is clear, solid, and important evidence that there was indeed a flight instructor on the plane. I think, and people are more than welcome, I would be anxious to hear the logical or any other sort of arguments against that conclusion. I think that it's very, very powerfully supported by the evidence. So, you now have what I had in terms of all of the evidence walking around with it, and I didn't know, All right, I got all this stuff. It's clear that something stinks. How do you interpret it? What does it mean? Let's quickly review the stuff that stinks. This outrageous finger in the eye to the Kennedys, a 15-and-a-half-hour delay. The killing of the story of tower contact, which is eminently a true story. The killing of the story of the flight instructor, which is certainly infinitely outweighed by the evidence that there was no flight instructor. I mean, 1 versus 0, the difference is infinite, right? 1 divided by 0. Apparent suicide, right? Two pieces of evidence for that, the radar and the fuel control valve. And the Egyptian Air 990 coincidence, how are we going to explain that? Well, let's take them one at a time. Killing of the story of the flight instructor, how are we going to deal with that? Well, the obvious conclusion, I think, is that there was a flight instructor on the plane. If those guys are telling us that there wasn't, without any evidence to support it, in contravention of all of the evidence, that means to me, that's solid evidence that there was a flight instructor on the plane. And if there was
I have a problem with that.
okay.
I'm not trying to give you a hard
No. You're welcome to give me a hard time. You maybe want to let me finish and then give me a hard time.
Well, just the only thing that I can...
Go ahead. Make it. I'm not going to answer it till I finish, and then I'll answer.
The only thing that I can see is that there's no proof that there was an instructor. Just because Lee Radswell and the other individual stated that there was, doesn't mean that there was one. Maybe he told them there was a flight instructor to calm their fears that he was flying prematurely with an injury or whatever.
Okay.
But, we'd have no proof that there was.
Well,
him telling them.
We'll get back to this at your pleasure. I'm going to quickly say there's no proof that the Earth goes around the sun. There's no proof that there was a Big Bang. There's no proof of evolution. That everything that we know in terms of science, practically, some of it's based on slimmer evidence than this, I think. But let's go on. My conclusion is that the flight instructor committed suicide, and now we can address the issue of the 15-and-a-half-hour delay. They delayed the search for 15-and-a-half hours because they were recovering the body of the flight instructor. I have videotape of the captain of the Civil Air Patrol, like he's a lieutenant. No, he's a colonel, Richard Stanley, in which he says, Well, gee, you know, I saw the Coast Guard. I was out there early this morning, and I saw the Coast Guard out there. The reporter asked him, he's just heard from Todd Bergen. The reporter has just heard from Todd Bergen, and he says to the guy from the Civil Air Patrol, who has been ordered to search the island exclusively, don't go over the ocean. You are to stay on land looking for that plane, he has been told. Did you hear anything, says the reporter, about this contact with the tower, and that he was on final approach? And the Colonel Richard Stanley says, no, I didn't hear that. I'm looking for the plane. Nice of them to not tell me. I didn't hear that, but you know, I saw the Coast Guard out there, and I guess that's what they were doing. That's what they were doing out there on the approaches to, well, the Coast Guard says it wasn't them. The Coast Guard says they didn't go there until 1:30 in the afternoon. Richard Stanley says he saw helicopters out there, or whatever. He thought they were the Coast Guard. I think he said helicopters. I'm rather certain. In any case, it's on the video. His exact words. Somebody was out there, and it's unaccounted for, right? There's no way to account for who it was that Richard Stanley saw out searching the approaches to Martha's Vineyard, and I would suggest that they recover the body of the flight instructor so that, I mean, if that's how you kill him, you have a Manchurian candidate, and I won't talk about this until I return the computer. We can talk about hypnotism and Manchurian candidates. It's very, very eminently clear to me that this is the easiest thing to do. Right, so you get some guy, you get him on the plane, he crashes the plane, and you recover the body. How can anybody ever figure out how you killed John Kennedy? You have, right, if you got the body of the flight instructor, they can never figure it out. And then the Egypt Air 990 coincidence, well, that Egypt Air 990 flight had the cream of the Egyptian military on it. And my suggestion is that the guys who programmed John Kennedy's flight instructor were then rewarded by getting to program the pilot on Egypt Air 990 and wipe out the cream of the Egyptian military. Now, you can ask yourself, if you care to, who might want to do that. I don't want to dwell on it, please, today. In any case, that's my conclusion, is that the pilots on both planes were Manchurian candidates, that they had been programmed to commit suicide by the same people in exactly the same fashion, which included turning off the fuel control valve. In Egypt Air 990, in a giant jet, it kills the engines instantly, and it's much more effective than it is in John's little plane, but we'll leave it alone. If anybody has another explanation for this evidence, I'd be delighted to hear it. I'm going to get busy. No, we're not done, but I'm going to get as busy as I can. Why? So, you know, I may lose you, but after I finish, we can go back over this. Why would anybody want to kill John Kennedy? Wasn't he just a stupid boob? I thought he was a stupid boob until I started to do the research. Many people have suggested that he was killed because he was going to run for office. I've done a lot of research on this. I don't feel the least bit uneasy about saying John was not going to run for office. He had stated it unequivocally to many people in the immediate future. He said that running for office is like going to war, and you don't go to war if you're not ready to go to war. I just got married. I'm not ready to go to war. I'm not ready to leave my wife and family behind and go off to war. And I'm doing a good job at George Magazine, as we're going to see right now, I think. Why would they kill him? He published Oliver Stone. Right? Kennedys are not supposed to use the name of Oliver Stone without spitting. He published Oliver Stone in an article on political assassination throughout history, in which Stone said that John's father was murdered by a conspiracy involving powerful forces within the government, and then focused on the details of the case of Napoleon having been poisoned by the British. The French have recently exhumed the body, and he's got poison in his hair follicles. John published an article that Richard Blow, his editor, begged him not to publish. In this article, the article was written by the mother of the guy who's in Israel in prison for killing Yitzhak Rabin. And the mother says, my son was an asset of the Mossad. He was controlled by, and she names the guy's name. I think it may be right there and it may not be. It's in the article. She names the Mossad agent that controlled her son. She said, in any case, my son could not possibly have penetrated the security around Rabin with 9/11 all over again. If there wasn't a stand down of the security, well, John Kennedy Sr.'s murder for that matter. This is dynamite stuff for John Kennedy to be publishing. I mean, he's either out of his mind, he's either incredibly stupid, or he's really, really incredibly brave. And after my investigation, I vote for brave. I haven't found any evidence to suggest that he was either suicidal or stupid. it's an article in which it suggests the government commits conspiracies to murder their own citizens. So I think that would be another reason. One, they'd want to kill him in retribution for the article about the Mossad. Two, they'd want to kill him because they couldn't trust him in a 9/11 environment to keep his big fat mouth shut. And I'm persuaded that they may have gone to people that they felt a little bit uneasy about in the news media and said, you watch what happens to John Kennedy this afternoon, and then you report, you do whatever you want in reporting about it, but you're next on the list. In any case, maybe nobody in the media profession were intimidated by John Kennedy Jr.'s death, but I'm inclined to doubt it. This is my favorite answer. I'm going to try to get through this in a hurry. This is a mafia, right? It's an oil and banking mafia. In the mafia, there's an expression called making your bone. And if you want to sit down at the table with the Dons, before you sit down at the table and are privy to their conversations and discussions of the crimes that they're going to commit, you have to commit a murder for them. I taught in South Central in the poorest high school in Los Angeles for 10 years, Jordan High School. I think Summer will back me up on that. And I had students who were murderers and leading gang members, and they explained to me, well, that's so that you can't rat them out. Right? If you want to join the inner circle of this gang, you have to commit a murder, because then they know that you are not going to be able to rat them out, because they have as much on you as you have on them. It's very, very clear, I think, that George Bush Sr. George Bush Sr.'s political career began immediately after the Kennedy assassination, and I'm going to make the case that he was very deeply involved in the Kennedy assassination. This is a memo many of you are familiar with, probably, written by J. Edgar Hoover, entitled Assassination of John Kennedy. It talks about misguided anti-Castro Cubans. Let's do it. Some misguided anti-Castro groups. So the FBI was investigating the anti-Castro groups, and they made their report to Mr. George Bush of the CIA. This is, I think, very, very clear evidence that Bush was a supervisor of the misguided anti-Castro groups. In any case, they're linked. They are both in the same memo. There's no question that that's a link. E. Howard Hunt is the most famous of the anti-Castro leaders, I believe. We're still reminding you, we're answering the question, how did he get his seat? By committing a murder. Hunt, there was an article in Spotlight magazine that said that Hunt was in Dallas the day that the president was murdered and was involved in the conspiracy to kill Kennedy. Hunt sued for slander. And when the jury had to evaluate that sentence, right? And in finding the magazine innocent, they couldn't have found the magazine innocent without finding Hunt guilty. And they voted that the preponderance of the evidence showed that Hunt was in fact a leader of the misguided anti-Castro Cubans that killed John Kennedy, and we won't go into the details of that. However, what's just astonishing is Prescott Bush's connections to E. Howard Hunt. Nixon says that Prescott is the guy who recruited him to politics, and Nixon hired Hunt. Prescott was Averill Harriman's first lieutenant. Harriman's second lieutenant was Bissell, and Bissell supervised Hunt at the Bay of Pigs. There's no argument about that. Prescott, again, is connected to Hunt. Hunt said in the trial that he worked for Averill Harriman as his press agent in Paris. He answered directly to Harriman immediately at the end of World War II. And Prescott was Harriman's first lieutenant. So that's it's 2 degrees of separation. Prescott was also on a first-name basis with Dulles, and on, but and planned with Dulles. We documented in letters from Prescott that he met with Dulles to plan the Bay of Pigs operation, and then we have the Hoover memo making a first-degree connection. And another connection is Watergate. Nobody in the White House had CIA operations background except Bush. And Bush not only had CIA operations background, but he had it in the Caribbean. Bush's first oil company was... He left Skull and Bones, where he was a brother under the skin, to the head of hiring for CIA, and he then went to work for a guy that is identified by his father as a recruiter for CIA, and he then went and established his oil company in the middle of CIA operations in the Caribbean in preparation for the Bay of Pigs. When Hunt was sitting in jail demanding $2 million or he would talk, the guy who coughed up the money was Bush's closest business associate, Bill Leitke, who helped him found that oil company in the middle of CIA operations. There's other stuff we're going to skip around. At the point of all of this was that, and Bush immediately, after the Kennedy assassination began his political career. And I'm not going to go into all of the details of that, but trust me, if you investigate it, you will find that his political career begins the day after the Kennedy assassination, and he's clearly a made man because he sucked at politics. He couldn't win an election to save his life, so they created an all-Republican district for him and got him elected to Congress, but he lost before that, and he ran unsuccessfully for Senate twice. He lost to Reagan, and they made him the vice president. How did George Jr. get his seat? If his father committed a murder, and, you know, I'm carrying around this weight of all this evidence. What the hell happened? I don't know. I know it stinks, but I don't know how to explain it. And I woke up one morning and said, the father killed the father, the son killed the son, and I got up, ran out of bed, ran to my computer. I had Dow Jones News Retrieval Service. It reads 5,000 newspapers and magazines every day and gives you 10 years of access. And I asked it, where was Georgie on the day that John Kennedy Jr. died? How did he get his seat? Well, on the morning, he was campaigning in Iowa. He was losing in New Hampshire. This was 2 months before the New Hampshire election. It's a critical time period. Flipping pancakes and kissing babies, and at 9 o'clock in the morning, he gets on a bus and drives off. John Kennedy Jr.'s plane crashes that night. The news media run the next day to Al Gore, and Al Gore says how brokenhearted he is and how he's going to cancel all his campaign appearances for the weekend out of respect. And then they run to Bush's office to see what Bush, and they had an angle, right? What does the son of a president have to say about the death of another son of a president? And they ran to Bush's office to get his answer, and his answer was none because he wasn't there. And they asked Bush's staff, where is he? Well, when is he going to be back? No answer to the question, where is he or when will he be back? They did not know. I'm done. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Microphone. Yeah.
Was that sound part of your presentation?
Yes. Good answer.
What were the official reports or unofficial reports of where the
Thank
bodies...
you so much.
Where the bodies were positioned in the seats? And how many
John,
seats
the
did that-
official report, I'm sorry.
How many seats did it have, 4 or 6?
It had 2 seats side by side in the front, and it had then a row of seats facing rear, and behind that in the very rear a row of seats facing forward. And
Can you tell me where the bodies
Yes.
were found?
John was pinned into the seat for the pilot, and the women's bodies were scattered on the ocean floor. And one of the seats was missing.
Which one?
I don't know. It doesn't say. And I would say the seat that they strapped the body of the flight instructor to before they drug him off, that seat. But I mean, bodies, like I said, 20% of the bodies get recovered at best from an ocean crash. And a seat disappears? Why would, I mean, they did a real good job. I experienced, having studied the Kennedy assassination for a long time, it was really sort of a withdrawal because there's so little evidence comparatively to the assassination of John Kennedy Jr. Right? You have 350 pages of NTSB. You have maybe 150, 200 pages of newspaper articles. That's about it. Well, I had this videotape from the Boston, which somebody sent me in the mail. Very, very, very thin stuff. And in Wellstone's case, it's another step removed. The NTSB report for Wellstone is, I think it's like 15 pages, maybe less. Let me just say quickly that on Wellstone, that Wellstone's radar is exactly the same. Plane is flying along, it's flying along in clear weather, no reported mechanical problems. They contact the tower, and for my money, somebody on the plane is programmed that whatever the sign-off is for the tower, that's the trigger that makes them grab the steering yoke and push it forward. But there's almost nothing on the Wellstone.
Do you have any clues or hints of who that person, the instructor...
On Wellstone's plane?
No, on JFK.
Oh. The easy answer is no. Take the microphone with you and pass it to Peter behind you. I found, right, after all of this years and years and years of pouring, I finally found the name of a flight instructor that John had that the NTSB didn't locate. And Josh Kallenberg. And I hired a private investigator and paid her $500, and she told me I was living in Venice at the time, and she wrote me a thing and said he's living in the apartments across the street in Marina del Rey. And she said, why don't you go over there? And I said, no, I don't think so. Yeah, I mean, it just, but she, before that, she told me that Kallenberg, she said that his record, his public record that you can access if you're a private investigator, was the most extraordinary thing she ever said. She said it was like finding a footprint in the sand on the beach by itself, with nothing leading up and nothing leading away. But there was this, in the public record, his medical exam for flight instructor. You have to take a medical to be a flight instructor, and he had taken it, and it was the only thing in the public record. And maybe she, anyway. Yes, Peter.
Well, I may be the only person in the room who was once in a plane where the pilot turned off the fuel tank. And he did so accidentally, and I'm not saying it's analogous.
Accidentally?
I don't know anything about whether it was an idiot button or not. But the point I'm raising is that that wasn't enough to put, I'm obviously still here. What happened was that the plane went into a very long, slow glide where the pilot was saying to me, Peter, look around, see if you can see a long highway with no cars on it. And then in the end, it turned out he was used to another plane, and where the switch went the opposite direction.
And didn't have an idiot button, apparently.
So I just wanted to make that comment about the long, slow glide. You'd have to have the action of pushing the stick forward as well.
Absolutely. Now, in fact, in my video, I replay where the guy turns it off and the motor dies because it's got sound, right? You hear the engine, and then you move the switch and the engine dies, and maybe John was stupid and accidentally did it, but that's not an explanation, because that accidentally turning off the fuel control valve in a Piper is not going to... The plane can fly half a mile for every 1,000 feet, and they were at 2,500, so it should have been able to fly for another 3 miles. And during that 3 miles, you just move the valve back and you turn the key and you start the thing up again and you take off, and there's no reason that it should have. Did your plane crash, or did he figured it out and he turned it back on and you started up and went on your way?
The other thing I wanted to say, just for the record, is you said that the Norman Mineta stuff is in the 9/11 report. It's very conspicuously not.
Oh, no kidding.
Right. What they haven't said is the substitute story that happened an hour later. There's no reference to Mineta's thing. It's really shocking, because he gave the story in open testimony. They had a chance, all the witnesses had a chance to ask him about it. Not one of them did. He had, actually there was corroborated, he could have been corroborated by the number 2 in FAA. He also testified in open testimony. They didn't ask him.
I thought you said that he had told, and that it was illicit. It wasn't, oh, it's not in the report. Oh, I'm sorry. So how do we know about it?
Because it is in the hearing.
Videotapes.
Does anybody have a videotape of the hearing?
He said it.
No, I understand that he said it.
And there's no one's ever doubted he said it. He said it more than once, or at least
Right, no,
3
you said
times
that.
He
Right.
told this story. It's just that...
But just so witnesses at the hearing have, somebody reconstructed the conversation.
It's transcribed.
Somebody transcribed it. I'm sorry?
Commission transcribed it, printed it.
Oh, but they didn't put it in the report.
In the hearings, but they didn't refer to it in the report.
All right, so there's a transcript of the hearings published by the commission.
Right.
Well, it's just like,
Similar to the Warren Commission.
yes, totally.
It was in the report.
Sure, I mean, similar is, I don't think the word, identical to the way the Warren Commission documents tell the opposite story of the report.
John?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I do need a clear answer as to whether the sound we heard at the end was actually part or not.
No, it was his cell phone.
All right, thank you.
I thought you were kidding, I'm so sorry.
Well, other than the tape, you can't tell.
Somebody asked me about Gary Webb. All right. Hey, John, what about Gary Webb? I mean, you guys want to hear about Gary Webb, or I don't want to force a topic on you. Well, we did Wellstone, right? Wellstone's radar is the same as John Kennedy Jr.'s radar. The conditions are identical, right? They're on final approach. They contact the tower, mechanically sound plane, no other evidence, clear skies, straight down. Actually, less straight down, but that might just be because they didn't do as detailed a report with Wellstone, and they probably just made it up. Oh, the mic.
Where's the mic?
John has it.
John has it.
Yeah, Mike wants it. Mike wants the mic.
Norco wants it, Norco.
The preponderance of evidence that I've read, I've read everything I think that's available right now on Wellstone, is that laser was used because it affected a bunch of people. Had equipment in the area, people just watching their cable television. It had an effect. And why don't you think that's a possibility with John F. Kennedy Jr.'s?
Well, there's no evidence of it. I won't say that it's not a possibility. There's not a shred of evidence to suggest it. In addition to which, I don't know what that means, right? To me, it's, does anybody really know about any of this stuff? Right, a laser did it. Right, to me, that's
Well, if you read one of Fetz's books, it goes into great detail
about
that.
about laser weapons.
Yeah, it's obviously been used numerous times.
And does it knock out the electronics?
Yeah.
Well, the electronics had not been knocked out on John's plane. You can determine that, right? I mean, I was talking about that. I know.
Well, when you talk about electronics, I don't know to the extent. I don't know to what extent.
Sure. Whether it just scrambles them or kills
It's
them.
the same reason that on a plane, when you take off, they tell you to shut off all your computer and the cell phones, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
It's the same principle.
Okay.
But I just don't know why you discount that as,
Well,
John F. Kennedy, has anybody looked into that? I mean,
No.
checked anybody in the area to see if any unusual occurrences about the time that plane crashed?
well, there are lots and lots and lots of people who have, and none of them, I mean, I don't think I'm going to remember the guy's name. He's from Los Angeles. He's a movie producer. He is a little bit cheesy. He's made a 9/11 video, and his name is escaping me at the moment. But I spoke with him, and he said that he interviewed I don't know how many witnesses, and he says that there was a bomb. He says all of these witnesses who said that they saw an explosion.
Not Michael Moore.
No. I mean, if you really are interested, contact me, and I'll probably remember. I just at this point I'm not going to bring it up. Anyhow, I'm not familiar with that sort of thing. One, and two is that if it did, I do know that the electronics didn't get knocked out. There were other pilots.
I don't know to what extent. Maybe I misspoke before. I said he knocked out.
No, I understand. I understand, and neither do I. But I know that the electronics, the NTSB report, I don't know it. The NTSB report says that all of the electrical systems that had to do with lights, because that's the only one that you can tell, all of the lights were on. All of the lights that were supposed to be on were on impact because all of the filaments were burned as a result of the crash. We got, John, you got your hand up? Oh, yeah, I can't walk around. I got a microphone.
Get back to Webb if you could.
Sure. So let me talk about Webb quickly, and then I'm sorry if you write it down. When Gary Webb was found dead, I was extremely disturbed by that. I took it very, very personally. I mean, I live in Los Angeles. My students suffered more from the crack trade than probably anybody on the face of the earth because their parents were crack addicts, and their peers and role models were crack dealers. Really, really, really a horrific situation. Anyhow, I heard that Gary Webb had been found and that supposedly it was a suicide. And Gary Webb had told a couple of friends of mine that if anybody told him that he had committed suicide, that they were not to believe it. Now, he told them this a couple of years ago, but he said it. And he might have forgotten that he said it and didn't bother to call these people up and say, oh, by the way, I'm taking that back. And if you do hear that I killed myself, it might be true. In any case, Mike Rupert was my hero at the time. I bought his 9/11 video and I sent him a check for $200 for his 9/11 video, because, you know, I wanted to be as supportive as I could be. And he said that Webb had shot himself with a shotgun in the head. Now, I was going to say, I don't know where he got that story. I do know where he got that story. He made it up. He couldn't have got it anyplace else. But I tried as hard as I could to contact Rupert and say, look, you're an ex-LAPD detective. You go detect, right? Do the job. I don't know anything about this crap. I'm supposed to go investigate it, and if you don't, I will, but I don't want to, because I don't know how. And I called up Maxine Waters, who had been very, very close with Gary Webb and who had sponsored the big thing, and I don't know if you know about it, but at Locke High School, that John Deutsch, the head of the CIA, came and stood for criticism by, 1,000 angry residents of South Central Los Angeles, and she wouldn't do anything about it. And so I had happened to have an encounter with a guy who was also interested in the Kennedy assassination and had published an article about Bush and the Kennedy assassination. And I called him up, and we were talking about it, and he said, well, I'm a private investigator, hire me. And I said, how much? And he said, $300. And I said, the check's in the mail. And he also said, you know, I'm good friends with the San Francisco coroner, and the San Francisco coroner is good friends with the San Jose coroner, and I'll have them write me a letter and get me in, and I will go in and I'll examine the body. And I said, you know, do it. And he did, and he went down there. He went down to the mortuary, and he ran into Gary Webb's family, and he's such a nice guy that he hit it off with Gary's ex-wife, and she invited him to come in, and he got to examine the body, and he got to photograph the body, and he said he couldn't find, there was blood coming out of the ear canal, he couldn't find an entrance wound of any other kind. There appeared to be 2 exit wounds, more or less here. And so I mean, you know, I'm doing what I did in this case, which is calling everybody I know and talking to them about it. And Joyce Riley said, why don't you call Cyril Wecht? And I said, because I don't know Cyril Wecht. And she said, well, here's his phone number. Call him. And so I called Cyril Wecht, and he said he was very interested, and he would do it for half his usual fee, which was $5,000. And my private investigator got the ex-wife. She told him, we're going to cremate it. And he said, no, you have to let us do an autopsy first. And she agreed. And then Rupert went up there and talked them into cremating the body. And, you know, told them all sorts of really ugly things about me, based on nothing. I mean, you know, he just made it up. He didn't know me. And got them, in any case, to cremate the body. And, you know, Rupert got there before the scene had been cleaned and did nothing while the scene got cleaned. And on his website, he cheered the fact that the murder scene had been destroyed. Wecht's assistant, Wecht didn't say this, I had much contact, Wecht pretty much said, yeah, I'll take it, $5,000, talk to my assistant to work out the details of how you're going to get the body to me. And so I had a much more extensive conversation with the assistant, who told me that Wecht told him that in, I think, 24,000 autopsies, he'd never seen 2 shots to the head, which is the official report, that Webb killed himself with 2 shots to the head. And I spoke to another individual who was referred to me by Joyce Riley, who investigated for a family, on behalf of a family whose son who killed himself while in the Army, and the family thought it was murder. And so she investigated. In the course of that investigation, she had to study headshots because he had been shot in the head. And she told me that if you shoot yourself in the head with a .38, the bullet probably won't get a chance to kill you because the concussion from the gun will kill you first. The point being that you can't shoot yourself in the head with a .38 blank twice, right? That the concussion from the first shot will kill you. Well, I think Peter said, well, how do they know that? Who did they use as a guinea pig, right? Who did they stick a .38 blank to the head and pull the trigger? You know, in any case, there is considerable reason to think that Gary Webb was murdered. In any case, there's screaming evidence, 2 shots to the head. There should have been an autopsy because a pathologist can tell whether the body was alive when the second shot was inflicted or not, right? They can look at the wound and tell whether this is a wound that was inflicted on a dead body or a body that had blood pressure. It was, I think that it's accurate to say that an autopsy was never performed. The coroner, I can say that it was never performed. The coroner ruled that it was a suicide without performing an autopsy, and I know that there was no autopsy performed because my investigator went and looked at the body right after the coroner finished and issued his report. My guy looked at the body and took pictures, and he's intact. Right? Certainly none of his, if there was an autopsy, none of his wounds were dissected. Yes?
If you cock a gun and then squeeze the trigger, doesn't that, what? I can speak louder.
We need them recording, we can't get it.
I could stand next to him, but okay.
I really have little experience with a pistol, but I thought if you cock a gun, you pull the hammer back
Yes.
part way, then you squeeze the trigger. That with one squeeze of the trigger, you could get off 2 rounds.
Certainly not. Not a
Oh,
38.
okay.
This is a 38 special.
Oh, I see.
Police special. No way. Yes,
what was
revolver.
Webb's motive?
I'm sorry?
What was Webb's motive?
Webb's motive for killing himself?
Not Webb's, but Rupert's motive for sabotaging the investigation.
You tell me.
Well, no, I'm here to listen to you.
Oh, all right. They're very good. Very good. Thank you so much. That's what I said, right? Rupert was my freaking hero.
Yeah.
And I said, what the hell's going on? And I said, I got to look into this. And so I went to his website, and I'm just poking around. And he has his police record on his website. And I said, well, let me look at his police record. And so I'm looking at his police record, which is, the last time I looked, it was still on his website. And I'm looking, and I'm discovering that he was a patrol officer. And I read the whole thing. He was a patrol officer. Well, in the 9/11 tape that I sent him $200 for, he starts off by telling John Deutsch, I'm a narcotics detective, former narcotics detective for the LAPD. He was not a former narcotics detective for the LAPD. He was not a detective of any kind, and he was not associated from his police file with narcotics. Then I read on where his testimony in front of the Senate. It's just ridiculous, the stuff that he told the Senate, that he met some whore in a bar, in a cop whore in a cop bar, and she told him that, she pointed to a submarine and said, see that submarine? It's full of cocaine. And that's the sum total of his investigation and knowledge about cocaine. I don't think I'm exaggerating. I'm not trying to exaggerate. I believe that that is the sum total. And at the funeral, he had the nerve to say that Gary Webb had told him, you got there first, Mike, meaning you got to the crack cocaine issue, which is just the most extraordinary crock of crap imaginable. But so you're welcome to interpret it any way that you like. The way that I interpret it is that Mike Rupert is a police operative, and that his job was to worm his way into the movement, and that he did that by, when he saw I was at the Crack the CIA parade with my daughter, who was this big. I have a vivid recollection, right, because I think my daughter was there, and my wife. I don't remember seeing Mike Rupert there. I don't remember seeing him speak. But he says that he was there in the middle, in the thick of things, and my personal experience was that that was not true. I could throw in, and I don't think I've ever mentioned this before, one of my best friends in high school, I ran into him years later, and we were talking about this and that and the other. And he was asking me what I was doing, and I started telling him about the Gary Webb story, and Mike Rupert's name came up, and he said, wait a minute, Mike Rupert? And blah, 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 LAPD, blah, blah, blah. And I said, yeah. I said, Rupert worked for me immediately after leaving the LAPD, and he never said diddle to us about crack or cocaine or anything else. He was an alcoholic, and it harmed his job, and he ended up getting fired from this job, says my best friend from high school. But Rupert says that he was thrown out because he was fighting this crack war that he has been fighting ever since, and you're not going to find that anyplace. It's maybe I shouldn't even repeat it because it's a personal anecdote. But my best friend is not a crack addict. He's got a small business in L.A. He's a very stable guy.
On the other hand, his story about being such a high-fluent cop. His story about being such a top cop. That's there's no corroboration for that either, is there? No, a narcotics cop, except what he tells us.
Absolutely none. Well, in fact, there's corroboration going the opposite way. What do you call it? It's contravention or contradiction.
Yeah.
It's dispositive. The evidence is dispositive of what Rupert claims. Sure.
I have a problem with the fact that if this was a suspected homicide, or if anything that fell under the that needed an autopsy, an unwitnessed death or accidental death, any forensic pathologist worth a damn would have sectioned the brain.
2 shots to the head? Give me a break.
They're going to do
And screaming.
Well, but they're going to do. They're going to section the head. They want to see her trajectory. They want to see. I had a case once. I used to work fire rescue, where a man was arguing with his wife. He was an ex-New York cop, arguing with his wife. She said, "You have another drink, I'm going to kill you." He mixed himself a Jim Beam.
And she shot him.
And she shot him. We got the call. Okay, we see a large man laying on his back, supine position, unresponsive, obviously dead. Okay? The cop said to me, we checked him out, he was obviously dead, no EKG, no signs of respiration, no pulse, blood pressure. Cop said to me, "Show me the entrance and or exit wound." Okay? I said, "Well, this is a crime scene. You want me to move him?" He said, do whatever you have to do." We checked him from stem to stern and found nothing. Okay? I was thinking maybe she threatened him with a gun and he fell down. He did have cerebrospinal fluid coming from his nose and ears, indicative of a skull fracture.
Right.
Okay? We checked him every way we could and found no signs of an entrance or exit wound. There was the weapon, as far as we knew, was a .38 special revolver, which was on the floor, a few feet from where I was standing. And I couldn't, he had a trace of blood coming out of the corner of his eye. Next day, I got a call from the ME's office, Broward County, and he asked me, he said, "What did you see?" I said, it's in my report. I saw no signs of wounds. I told him what the police had told, what was told to the police prior to our arrival. And I got a call back. Get a call back from a couple hours later saying we found the bullet, we traced it back and forth, and he was shot in the corner of his eye. The bullet hit him there. Obviously didn't do enough damage there were no external signs of trauma. And he was, in effect, shot in the head.
And it didn't exit.
And there was no exit, which is common. I've seen a number of gunshot wounds to the head where there's no exit wound. Bullets do strange things.
Okay.
Totally unpredictable.
Okay.
And that was it. He was shot. I couldn't have told you where. Probably in the inner canthus of his eye, but that's it. And I had a number of calls on similar situations from the ME, because we were usually the first on the scene, and we had whatever we saw was usually close to the time of incident.
But so your point is that you need to have an autopsy.
They would do it.
Sure, no, it's outrageous that you'd have a suicide with 2 shots to the head and not have
Even
an
a
autopsy.
normal
But,
autopsy,
I mean,
they
do you know who Gary Webb is?
Beg your pardon?
Do you know who Gary Webb is?
I'm vaguely familiar with the name.
He wrote a book called Dark Alliance. He wrote a series of articles for the San Jose Mercury News. He nailed the Bushes as the source of the crack trade. He nailed right that it was Oliver North, Danilo Blandone, and then Ricky Ross and an army of lieutenants that supplied Los Angeles with thousands of pounds of cocaine, I think a month. They also supplied them with automatic weapons. The murder rate in Los Angeles at that time was 10,000. It's now less than 1,000. Right? They pushed the murder rate up 10 times. right? Autogenocide, I think, is the word for what they managed to foment. The point, and Ricky Ross exposed all of that. And I'm sorry, Ricky Ross. Gary Webb and Ricky Ross, I mean, give Ross his due, exposed all of that. And I think while the media, were sleeping dogs and let it lie, could easily be depicted as the worst enemy, having committed the worst assault on George Bush and his reputation. George Bush lost the election subsequent to Webb's articles, George Bush Sr. So it's not the least bit surprising to me that a coroner would look at this case and say, I don't think I'm going to do an autopsy on this one. It looks like a suicide to me. Right? I mean, it's understandable that that sort of political pressure might have been, and obviously that sort of political pressure was brought to bear, because how do you not do an autopsy in a suicide with 2 shots to the head? But although the coroner's report was suicide by 2 shots to the head, that was the official report.
Well, coroner or medical examiner.
Yeah.
Different.
Oh, I don't know the difference, and it may have been a medical examiner instead of a coroner. I have not the slightest idea. I'm sorry? Okay.
I had just finished, does this work?
Yes, it's going in, it goes into the...
I had just finished Dark Alliance when that happened. It was just a couple of years ago, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I wanted to tell something. 16 months ago, they had the second media reform conference in St. Louis, and Diane Watson was there, and she told a story about a small gun shop in L.A. and the story of it being protected, and currently. And I went up after and asked her if that stuff was still going on, and she said, "Oh yeah."
Which stuff?
All the Iran-Contra, that was part of Iran-Contra, right? What Gary
Yes.
found out was
Crack in the CIA.
You're talking about the crack scourge in Los Angeles? The crack scourge in Los Angeles is over. I mean, compared to what it was. Actually, I'm not teaching in South Central at the moment, but at Jordan High School, very close to 2/3 of the kids were in foster care. And I don't want to just throw out a statistic, because obviously I think it should be obvious that there isn't one. I would guess that half of the kids had parents who were crack addicts, had parents or guardians who were crack addicts, and those kids don't smoke crack, right? It's sort of an interesting phenomenon. The kids of crack addicts do not smoke crack, right? They don't use drugs because they see what it did to their parents and they leave it the hell alone. And that, that has to be a factor, but I think that the factor is Gary Webb's work and the fact that they got burned by it, right? And that the people of South Central know that the CIA is behind the crack trade, so that if you're standing on a street corner selling crack, you're working for the CIA, right? And it's not even, I mean, I think that you can't say CIA, you have to use a different word, because the people who are doing this, I think, by and large, are not doing it at the directions of the director of CIA. Oliver North was not director of CIA, right? And Danilo Blandon was not anything, you know what I'm saying? But there are people who are CIA connected who are surrounding it. So anyway, the people connected to the intelligence services of the United States, when Blandon got arrested, it was the CIA that intervened. I'm going to tell that because it's going to take me 40 seconds. Danilo Blandon is right. He's right directly under Oliver North and directly above Ricky Ross. He gets arrested with 2 pounds. He was going to a party and he took along 2 pounds, and some cop who didn't have anything better to do pulled him over and found 2 pounds of cocaine in his trunk. Well, geez, you're going to do life. In Los Angeles at that time, you were going to do life for 2 pounds of cocaine. And the CIA intervened, got him released, got him $40,000 reward and a green card. Because what they did is they released him and got him to bust the guy underneath him. Well, that's not the way law enforcement is supposed to work. We cut you a deal to bust the guy that is supervising you, not to bust the guy that you're selling the drugs to. But that's the direction that they went. And it's, God, the LA Times attacked the crap out of Gary Webb and then published the article about the trial. Ricky Ross, who was the guy on the downsides, said, what am I doing in prison? I'm working for the CIA too, right? I didn't know it, but that doesn't, right? If Danilo Blandon gets $40,000 in a green card for doing what the CIA told him, why am I getting sentenced to life in prison? And I don't know what the upshot of that trial. The LA Times covered this beautiful little report and then never said another word about Ricky Ross or Gary Webb. Well, they may have kicked Gary Webb after he died a few times just for good measure. I'm done. Go ahead.
Part of the reason I knew John Hankey to invite him to the conference is that when he got to the point that Cyril Wecht agreed to do the autopsy, he didn't have the funding himself to pay even the half rate, and he called me and asked me could I help him get in touch with other people in the research community to put up a fund, which I did. And he was, from that point on, vilified by a large segment of the research community as some kind of charlatan.
It's
Was trying to.
a tiny segment of the research community.
It was large enough in my circle. I heard it from several places.
Oh,
I
no
didn't
kidding.
expect to hear
Well,
it.
Lisa Pease, but I don't know
But
who
no,
else.
it was more than Lisa. But
No kidding.
who were then being influenced, I guess, by Rupert. And Lisa was part of this chorus that she went up and she met the family, and the family believed it was suicide, and that was good enough for her, and therefore there didn't need to be an autopsy. And this was just making trouble, and we were upsetting the family by asking for this. Well, the reason that you have a medical examiner and the reason you have a coroner and you have some procedures for autopsies, or courts can have inquiries, and is that families sometimes have to be overridden. Families, even if it's not anything sinister, for the sake of emotional closure, often want to just put the body in the ground and be done with it. But you have a public interest, even in a person that dies on the street, much less the political interest of somebody like Gary Webb. I mean, it would be like the King family saying, well, we don't want to do an autopsy. I mean, he's their relative, but he belongs to the world as well, and he belongs to the community he lives in, and in Gary's Webb case, he belongs to a lot of us. And so the net effect of this intervention, which destroyed the crime scene and got, a cremation, was that we will never know for sure how he died, except for Kangus's photographs that clearly showed the two exit wounds coming out of his head. And I had a similar case where I was called some years ago by Abby Hoffman's son at the time of his death, and I was suspicious already of the death because it was the same damn coroner who had given a false report on Jessica Savage's murder in the same town. And so, I told him about my suspicions about that, and that this guy lied about that, and he said that the coroner told him the day after he was going in on Friday to say there's no foul play, and he said, well, how do you know that there's no foul play, because we don't have any results back, and so then he was announcing already that it was suicide even before they got any stomach, remains or anything else, and then, after several days, they get this delayed report that there were all these pills in his stomach. But there were many physical things, including the son told me that he had blood running down out of his nose, which is not what you get from taking barbiturates and alcohol. And there were indications that he was in bed, fully dressed except for his shoes when they found him. And like his son said to me, my dad was a communicator. If he was going to kill himself, he would have wrapped himself in a flag and jumped off the Empire State Building. All right? And so you have one of these leading people, and of course the way they played it is, look and see, if you live this kind of a lifestyle as a radical, this is how you're going to end up. That was the media message that we got from it. But similarly, I had approached Cyril Wecht, and Cyril was willing to go in and do an autopsy for the son on his behalf. And right then, Joanna, the so-called running mate, and Jack, his brother, had the body cremated. And so it was impossible to do the work. But you've moved a little from when I saw you in LA, you weren't quite sure what happened to the plane, and I see that you've sort of taken this tack that perhaps, and it's possible, because I do have evidence in other flights of people that appear to be programmed to wreck the flight. One of those is KL-007, and some programming. And it is possible to program in suicide, or even something that, maybe what they program in is push this button, turn this knob when you get the signal. You don't even connect it with suicide.
The reason in John's plane that you would ever turn off the fuel control valve is if the engine catches fire.
Yes.
And so all you have to do is program the guy that when you hear this, your plane is going to burst into flames, and the only way you can save the lives of yourself and everybody on board is to plunge it into the water as soon as you can.
So that's a possible. But I've also, in Candy Jones's case and in Luis Angel Castillo, the programmed assassin of Marcos, these were people who were programmed to kill themselves. And there's some thought that his time at Baylor University, George de Mohrenschildt was similarly programmed and then triggered by a phone call to blow his head off before the House Select Committee could get to him. But Candy Jones slashed her wrists on basis of a call, and they used psychohypnotic drugs and different programming, and it was eventually broken down. Luis Angel Castillo, given certain dates or commands, would take a gun and aim it at you and shoot it, but other commands he would put it to his own head, pull the trigger. So I think they can program even in suicide itself, or something where you're thinking you're doing something else. So I think all that's a possibility, but I keep wondering if there wasn't a way, and maybe it's not the imps, but a way to influence, that valve. It seems like it's all entirely mechanical. In other words, there
completely.
isn't any electronic way to shut that
That's correct.
valve off.
So, did you ask? There you go.
I also had talked to people who were personal friends, family friends of the Egypt Air pilot, who told me he was not radical Islamic. He was not.
He's a family man.
Yes, not depressed, not any of that. So it would have had to have been overridden. That's why I said last night that one possible explanation about how do you get an experienced military or civilian pilot to do the 320-degree descending loop of Flight 77 to hit the Pentagon is that it could have been Burlingame. It was a long-term Vietnam veteran, hard as nails pilot. That in other words, the American pilot could have been programmed to do the maneuver.
That's the guy who practiced it the year before?
And he was part of an exercise the year before about a plane hitting the Pentagon. And, he was involved in that. So.
Yeah, no, if you've been to see a hypnotist, and this is another issue that maybe you know something about, I don't. Everything that I've heard says that John's flight instructor, for example, would have had to have been programmed hours before, and that if you let it go much beyond that, it becomes very unreliable. And, I went to see a hypnotist, and my experience watching this guy was that you can get anybody to do anything. You just have to frame it right? Take the gun and put it to your head, because it's the only way you can save yourself, right? If you don't do that, you'll blow your brains all over the side. But if you do that, you'll be doing just the right thing to save your life. And they totally move on that.
Yeah. I think the program, that may be true of just sort of suggestive hypnosis that wears off. But I think in Candy Jones's case, the guy put her under regular hypnosis and then started an IV drip of psychohypnotic drugs. And then there's other kinds. I think there's deeper level programming, like Sirhan still can't remember what he was doing.
Well, they've been working on it for 40 years at least,
exactly.
right?
I mean, I'm just saying, what you think, you go to a hypnotist, it wears off after a while. You start drinking, you start smoking again, or something like that. But this is programming at a different level. On the other hand, there's Chuck Colson's testimony about Dorothy Hunt's plane, where you did have a massive electronic failure. The plane basically broke, the flaps went up, and it stopped in midair and dropped like a stone.
Right.
Kind of similar to what you're showing here, this pattern. Captain Whitehouse, and he announced that, because he was still on the talking, but he said something's going wrong with the plane, all the electronics are going screwy, and there was this man, and Chuck Colson in his testimony said Mrs. Hunt was delivering money to the Cubans in Chicago when they shot her plane down. And they don't follow up with that with a second question or anything. He just keeps going on in the testimony. But that's the phrase. They shot her plane down. Well, so maybe they do have something to shoot it with, whether it's laser or electronics or amps or something that can. And in Wellstone's case, the one, they had an experienced pilot and a younger pilot in training. The experienced pilot it came out, fraudulently gotten his license by concealing an earlier felony conviction and a fraud case, and he stole a lot of money, so he could have still owed people money. And it's possible, I thought in that case, possible that, not that they could tell him to kill himself, but that they could say, Joe, put this package on that flight and deliver it to the other end. And the package somehow was an electronic signal that did something. But the other guy, interestingly enough, the younger guy, had been at the same training school as Moussaoui. And when they raided Moussaoui's apartment, there was a DVD about how to fly a 757 with this guy's name on it. That's the second pilot in the Wellstone crash. But you put 2 pilots on, you've got extra security. There was no icing of the wings. They, like you said, last-minute contact with the tower, and then all of a sudden the plane's going in a 90-degree different direction and diving down. And one of the women nearby, though, that was a ear witness, said that she heard the plane engine go off and then sputter back on just before the crash. So, it might be different plane to plane how you can compromise it, but if the only way that thing is going to work is mechanically, and it's got an idiot button, it seems that they had to get somebody to push it.
Right. Thanks for pointing that out, because I didn't have an answer to his question when he asked me why I didn't think it was an EMS. Is that what you said? Or a laser?
I'd just like to add a couple of words about Abbie Hoffman. My mother was a personal friend of his in the 1960s, and about a week after he died, our friend Aaron Kay, also known as the Pie Man, who pied many famous politicians, flew out to Los Angeles, and we met with him, and he had seen Abbie like 2 weeks before he died, and he was apparently becoming involved with some case to do with the Tennessee Valley Authority with Amy Carter, and was working on an entirely new bunch of environmental work, and was not in the least bit depressed, and had no indication whatsoever that he was planning to kill himself, because he was just getting involved with a brand new bunch of political activity, and basically at the time all of us concluded that he had to have been murdered, because there was nothing to indicate that he would have committed suicide, and that was by people who had seen him right before he died and who knew him well. So I just is anyone looking any further into what happened surrounding his death? I mean, I know obviously no autopsy could be performed, but I mean, has anyone done anything in the way to investigate?
Not that I know about,
No.
but I wouldn't be the person to ask.
I did stuff at the time, and I also talked to Dave Dellinger, who's a close friend with Abbie, who had talked to him, right before this happened, and said that he was in a jovial mood. He was excited that there was new activity on the campuses. He had done that counter-recruiting thing against the CIA on campus and trying to push them off with Amy Carter, and I think significantly Amy Carter's not at the funeral. A year before, Abbie had written the first article that got published about the I think it was about the October surprise, or a little bit of it, but the article in Playboy. And on the way to deliver the manuscript, he said that his brakes failed, and he slammed into the back of a truck, and he'd hurt his leg, and he was still having trouble with the leg a year and a half later, but he thought somebody must have messed with his brakes. And that story was there, and he had gotten he had an airline ticket to visit his mother. Jeez. And he had speaking gigs arranged at these colleges. So I mean, there's no indication that this is a guy in some kind of a depressed state that's about to to end his life. And it comes in a politically important time, when things are starting to move in that other direction, that they take out this leader who goes back into the.
What year is that?
94.
Yeah, it was 94.
93, 94, 94.
Or maybe Colby, right, is apparently murdered. The head of the CIA, who I think produced the.
Oh, Colby.
Colby, yeah. But I mean, they just waited, and eventually, hey, we better kill him before he dies.
He had put out something about 2 weeks before in a music magazine about his suspicions about the Kennedy assassination.
Oh, is that right?
Casey also?
Oh, Casey also. I mean, right, Woodward being at Casey's death does not fill me with confidence that Casey died of natural causes.
To get the nurse's uniform, Bob.
Well, so I guess we're done, yeah?
I got a question. Can I
Sure,
get
yeah.
one in?
Why not?
The pattern of a dive into the ocean, when planes dive, it's frequently because of the stall. You didn't say anything about that possibility. Do you have anything to say about that?
When you say stall, that's different from when a car stalls, right? A car stalls, it's because the motor dies. When a plane stalls, right.
Going too steep and then...
Going too steep, too slow. That would be in the radar, and it's not. Right, the radar is very clear that he's going along just fine, and then suddenly straight down.
Didn't they have some kind of a disorientation story about how?
Oh, sure. No, that's the official story, is that he was spatial disorientation. And they call it a graveyard spiral, except that if you look at the thing, it's not 360 degrees. It's in the, I don't know, 1.5 minute, 2.5 minute, 2,500-foot drop, it makes about 180 degrees, maybe 240 degrees of a turn. But that's not going to, you can't use that to explain the spatial disorientation that caused it to go straight down, right? That was during the entire course of the plunge into the sea. It did 240 degrees. Well, you might get spatially disoriented if you did 240 degrees, but he wasn't making any sort of a turn when he suddenly went, well, I mean, he was making, I think, a very, 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 like 15 degrees of a turn on a flight that he had made 8 times in the previous 2 months, and I don't know how many times in the previous 20 years. It was his favorite approach to when other people flew into Martha's Vineyard, they would sometimes come in over the ocean, and what he would do is come in and line himself up with the coast and fly over the coast and then turn left as soon as he got to the airport. But the reason that he did that was it allowed him to fly over his mother's house, and he liked to fly over his mother's house. And so if you're going to say that he committed suicide, that means that he committed suicide on the day before his youngest cousin's wedding to ruin her wedding. He did it in his mother's front yard, and the wreckage of the plane, parts of it at least, washed up on the beach of his mother's front yard. And he did it after telling the people at the meeting, as long as I'm alive, you people have jobs, right? I mean, it'd be a very, very dark and sick and sinister picture of John Kennedy Jr. that you would have to develop in order to present that as being some kind of evidence.
What's the date that the plane goes down?
July 16th, 99.
Because it seemed to me that it was either the same day or the next day to the anniversary of the Chappaquiddick.
It was very close to the anniversary of Chappaquiddick. I mean, it's always been one of, and I apologize for not being able to tell you that. I think it's more like a week, but it could be a day or two off. The picture that everybody's seen of John Kennedy Jr. saluting at his father's funeral was John's birthday. So the guys who killed the father managed to time it so that the funeral would be on the birthday of the son. The pictures of the birthday party were all the women and all the excuse me, but I got a little boy who looks just like that. Anyhow, everybody's in black, and they're having a birthday party for this kid. I'll put the camera on. Anyway.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Good work.
Thanks.
You got a mic on?
Oh, I sure do. Whew.
Okay, anyone have the local time? So we ran a little over, but we'll try and come back around 8, I guess, and then I've got a whole stack of different kinds of videos on assassinations and 9/11, and so I can look at whatever people who kind of take a vote. Try to have a democracy.
Try.